All right, so get this. We're about to do a deep dive into UK criminal law.
Oh, wow.
You sent over some lecture notes on this, and let me tell you, this stuff is intense.
Yeah.
Murder, manslaughter, it's not exactly light reading, but some of these cases are absolutely gripping.
I bet.
There's this one, the Attorney General's reference from 1997, where a pregnant woman was stabbed and the baby was born prematurely but later died.
Oh, gosh.
It raises this whole question of when life legally begins.
Yeah.
Thankfully, I've got our legal expert here to help us make sense of it all.
Well, I'm happy to try to clarify things.
What do you say we try to untangle some of these legal knots together?
Sounds good to me.
Okay, so let's start with the basics.
All right.
When we talk about murder in the UK, what exactly are we talking about?
Well, good question.
What does the law actually consider to be murder?
Well, believe it or not, our understanding of murder still rests on a definition from the 1600s.
Really?
Sir Edward Coke, a legal scholar way back then,
Oh.
said murder is the unlawful killing of a reasonable creature in being under the Queen's peace with malice aforethought.
Whoa, okay, that's...
It's a bit of a mouthful,
Yeah,
you know.
that definitely needs some unpacking.
Definitely.
So, unlawful killing seems pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
But what about this reasonable creature and being? Does that just mean a living person?
For the most part, yes.
Okay.
But then you get cases like the one you mentioned, the Attorney General's reference from 1997, where things get complicated.
Right.
The baby, in that case, was born alive but died later because of the attack on the mother.
Yeah.
So the court had to figure out if the attacker could be charged with murder even though the baby wasn't born when the attack happened.
Oh, I see.
It all comes down to this question of when a fetus is legally considered a person.
So in that case, they couldn't charge the attacker with murder because the baby was born alive?
Right.
But they did convict him of manslaughter, right?
Exactly.
Well,
It's a fine line, but it shows how important these legal definitions are when it comes to serious crimes.
yeah, definitely. So we've got the unlawful killing of a living person.
Right.
But then there's this whole malice aforethought thing.
Oh, yeah.
That sounds pretty intense.
It does, doesn't it?
What exactly does that mean?
It sounds scary, but it's really about intent.
Okay.
Malice aforethought basically means the killing was intentional, not an accident.
Gotcha.
There are two types of intent the law looks at.
Right.
Direct intent, where the goal is to kill, and indirect intent, where the person may not have set out to kill, but they knew their actions were almost certain to result in death or serious harm.
So if I'm understanding this right, direct intent would be like a classic planned murder.
Exactly.
But what about indirect intent? Can you give me an example of that?
Absolutely. Let's say someone sets fire to a building knowing there are people inside.
Okay.
Their main goal might be to destroy the building, not specifically to kill anyone, but they understand that death is a very likely outcome.
Ah.
That's a classic example of indirect intent.
So it's not just about the act itself, but also about what the person understood about the consequences of their actions.
Exactly.
That makes sense.
Yeah. And proving that understanding is a key part of the prosecution's case.
So this brings up another question.
Okay.
Let's say someone does something reckless and someone dies, but they didn't actually mean for anyone to get hurt.
Okay.
How does the law deal with situations like that?
That's where the concept of causation comes in.
Okay.
It's about establishing a link between the defendant's actions and the victim's death.
Uh-huh.
You mentioned recklessness that can be a factor in cases of what's called involuntary manslaughter, where there wasn't an intent to kill.
Right.
But death still resulted from unlawful actions or gross negligence.
Okay, so even if someone didn't directly intend to kill,
Yeah.
they can still be held responsible if their actions caused the death.
That's right.
I'm starting to see how complex this all gets.
It definitely can be.
Yeah.
There's a famous legal test called the but-for test.
What's that?
It asks, but for the defendant's actions, would the victim have died? If the answer is no, then it establishes a causal link.
Okay.
But it's not always that clear-cut.
Can you give me an example, like a real-life case where this but-for test came into play?
There's a case, R.V. Watson, where a burglar threw a brick through a window, scaring an elderly man who then had a fatal heart attack.
Oh, gosh.
The burglar didn't physically harm the man,
Wow.
but the question was whether his actions contributed to the man's death.
So in that case, even though the burglar didn't intend to kill anyone, his actions were a factor in the man's death.
Exactly, and the court ultimately found him guilty of manslaughter.
Oh, wow.
It's a good example of how the law has to consider the ripple effects of someone's actions.
Yeah.
even if the outcome wasn't part of the original plan.
That's really interesting. So we've covered murder, which is the intentional killing of someone.
Right.
But you mentioned manslaughter a couple of times.
Yep.
What exactly is the difference between murder and manslaughter?
That's a great question, and it's one that often causes confusion. The main difference lies in intent and what are called mitigating circumstances.
Okay.
Manslaughter is essentially a category of homicide, where the killing may not have been intentional, or there are factors that reduce the defendant's responsibility.
So it's like murder is when someone sets out to kill someone else.
Right.
Well, manslaughter is more about situations where death happens, but the intent to kill isn't as clear, or there are other factors at play.
That's a good way to put it.
Okay.
And within manslaughter, we have two main categories.
Okay.
Voluntary manslaughter and involuntary manslaughter.
Okay, so two different types of manslaughter.
Yeah.
What's the difference between those?
With voluntary manslaughter, the killing might meet the criteria for murder, but there are mitigating circumstances that lessen the defendant's blame.
Okay.
Think of situations where someone loses control because of extreme provocation, or they were suffering from a diminished mental capacity.
So like if someone is being abused and they snap and kill their abuser,
Yeah.
or if someone with a severe mental illness commits a killing.
Those are good examples.
Mm-hmm.
In those cases, the act of killing might be there. But the law recognizes that there are other factors that contributed to the crime.
And what about involuntary manslaughter? How is that different?
Involuntary manslaughter covers situations where there's no intention to kill at all, but death results from either unlawful acts or gross negligence.
Mm.
Let's take the example of a drunk driver who causes a fatal accident.
Okay.
They didn't set out to kill anyone, but their actions were reckless and resulted in a death.
Okay, I'm starting to see the difference.
Good.
So with voluntary manslaughter, there might have been an intent to kill,
Yeah.
but there were mitigating circumstances.
Right.
But with involuntary manslaughter, there's no intention to kill, but the actions were still unlawful or grossly negligent.
You got it. And it's important to note that the punishments for manslaughter can vary widely, depending on the circumstances of the case and the specific type of manslaughter involved.
Wow, this is already so much to think about, and it seems like there are a lot of gray areas and legal nuances to consider.
It definitely can be, and we haven't even scratched the surface yet.
Oh no.
There's a whole world of legal precedent and fascinating cases that illustrate these concepts in action.
Well, I'm definitely ready to dive deeper into those cases.
Right.
Maybe we can focus on voluntary manslaughter next and unpack those special defenses you mentioned.
Okay.
Diminished responsibility, loss of control, and suicide pact.
Sounds like a plan.
Yeah.
I think you'll find those cases particularly intriguing.
I'm sure I will. All right, so we've established that manslaughter is a bit of a different beast than murder.
It is, yeah.
It's about those cases where maybe there wasn't an outright intention to kill.
Right.
Or there were some seriously extenuating circumstances involved.
Exactly, and as we touched on earlier,
Yeah.
you have these two main types,
Okay.
voluntary manslaughter and involuntary manslaughter.
Right.
They might sound similar,
Yeah.
but legally they're very distinct.
Okay, so let's break them down one by one.
Okay.
Let's start with voluntary manslaughter. What kind of scenarios would fall under that category?
Think of voluntary manslaughter
Yeah.
as the kind of case where, on the surface, it might look like murder.
Yeah.
There's a killing, and there might have even been intent.
Right.
But then you dig a little deeper and you find factors that make the situation much more complex.
So it's not as clear-cut as someone planning out a murder in cold blood.
Right. With voluntary manslaughter, you often have these intense, emotionally charged situations where someone might have lost control or wasn't thinking clearly.
You mentioned earlier something about special defenses that can come into play with voluntary manslaughter.
Oh, yeah.
What exactly are those defenses?
The three main ones are diminished responsibility, loss of control, and suicide pact.
Okay.
These defenses are basically legal arguments that acknowledge the complexities of human behavior and the factors that can contribute to a crime, even a violent one.
So let's unpack each of these defenses. What exactly does diminished responsibility mean in a legal context?
Diminished responsibility basically acknowledges that sometimes people commit acts they wouldn't normally commit if they were in their right state of mind.
Okay.
The law recognizes that mental illness or abnormality can affect someone's judgment and actions.
So if someone with a severe mental illness commits a killing,
Right.
they could argue diminished responsibility.
Exactly. But it's not as simple as just saying, oh, I have a mental illness, so I'm not responsible.
Right.
The defense has to prove that the illness was a significant factor in the crime, that it impaired the person's ability to understand what they were doing or control their actions. There's a law, the Coroners and Justice Act 2009,
Okay.
that lays out very specific criteria for this defense.
So it's not a get out of jail free card.
Right.
There's a high bar for proving diminished responsibility.
Yeah.
What about the loss of control defense?
Oh,
What does
yeah.
that involve?
Loss of control focuses on those explosive moments where someone might react violently due to extreme circumstances. It's about acknowledging that human beings can be pushed to their breaking point, and sometimes that results in tragic consequences.
Okay, so it's not just any old argument or disagreement, right?
No.
There have to be specific circumstances that would make a reasonable person lose control.
Right. The law has to walk this fine line.
Mm.
It recognizes that people can be driven to act in ways they normally wouldn't,
Right.
but it also has to protect against people using loss of control as an excuse for violence.
So what kind of situations would qualify for a loss of control defense? What are some examples?
Well, the Corners and Justice Act, 2009, which we talked about earlier, actually lays out two specific qualifying triggers for loss of control:
Okay.
fear of serious violence and a justifiable sense of being seriously wronged.
Right.
Let's say someone is in an abusive relationship and they kill their abuser in a moment of terror during an attack.
Okay.
That could be a case for loss of control.
So it has to be a genuine fear of immediate danger, not just a general feeling of being threatened.
Exactly. And the other trigger, a justifiable sense of being seriously wronged, is where things get even more complicated.
How so?
Well, what constitutes being seriously wronged
Yeah.
can be subjective, right?
Right.
Take the case of R.V. Hatter, for example.
Okay.
This guy killed his ex-girlfriend after she started seeing someone new.
Oh, wow.
He tried to argue loss of control, saying he felt seriously wronged. But the court said, no heartbreak doesn't usually meet the threshold for a justifiable sense of being wronged.
So basically the courts are saying, yeah, breakups are rough, but they don't give you a license to kill.
Pretty much the law is looking for situations that are objectively really bad.
Okay.
Something that would make a reasonable person feel like they've been extremely wronged. It's not about just any old argument or hurt feelings.
Okay, that makes sense. So fear of serious violence.
Right.
Or a truly justifiable sense of being wronged.
Yeah,
Those are the two big triggers for the loss of control defense.
exactly.
What about the third one, suicide pact?
Okay.
That one seems pretty straightforward.
It does on the surface,
Yeah.
but even suicide pacts have legal complexities.
Oh, really?
It's when two or more people agree to end their lives together.
Right.
If one person survives,
Uh-huh.
they could still face manslaughter charges.
So even in a situation as tragic as that, the law still has to determine responsibility and assign consequences.
It's a delicate balance.
Mhm.
The courts have to consider the intent of the parties involved,
Yeah.
the circumstances of the agreement, and whether anyone was coerced or pressured into participating.
This has given me a lot to think about.
Yeah.
It really shows how the law has to account for the full spectrum of human emotions and situations.
It does. Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about involuntary manslaughter.
Okay.
Remember, this is where there's no intention to kill at all, but a death still occurs due to either an unlawful act or gross negligence.
Okay, so let's start with unlawful act, manslaughter, also known as constructive manslaughter.
All right.
What exactly does that mean?
Think of it this way. Someone does something illegal, and even though they didn't mean for anyone to die,
Yeah.
their actions end up causing a death. The classic example is the bar fight scenario.
Like one punch leads to a head injury, and then tragically death.
Exactly. The punch was illegal, it carried a risk of harm, and it led to the death, even if the person who threw the punch didn't intend to kill. That's a textbook case of constructive manslaughter.
So it's not just about the act itself being illegal,
No.
but it also has to be dangerous and directly lead to the death.
Exactly. Let's look at another example.
Okay.
There's this case, R.V. Lamb, where two friends were playing around with a revolver.
Oh, gosh.
They didn't realize it was loaded. One pointed at the other, pulled the trigger, and boom, his friend was dead.
Oh, wow. That's a terrible accident. But why would that be considered manslaughter?
Because even though it was an accident, pointing a loaded gun at someone is an illegal act.
Yeah.
And in this case, it directly led to the death. It's a stark reminder that even seemingly harmless actions can have devastating consequences if they're against the law and carry a risk of harm.
So the law is basically saying you should have known better.
Right. And there's another case, DPP v. Newberry, that illustrates this point even further.
Okay.
Two teenagers threw a paving slab off a bridge, and it hit a train, killing a guard.
Oh, my gosh.
They didn't mean to kill anyone,
Right.
but throwing the slab was considered criminal damage, which is an unlawful act.
So even if they didn't intend to hurt anyone, the fact that they did something illegal and that illegal act led to a death means they can be held responsible for manslaughter.
You've got, it highlights the importance of understanding that our actions has consequences. And sometimes those consequences can be far more serious than we ever intended.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've covered constructive manslaughter,
Right.
where death results from an unlawful act.
Yeah.
What about gross negligence manslaughter? How is that different?
Gross negligence manslaughter is a bit trickier.
Okay.
It's about situations where there wasn't an intentional unlawful act, but the level of carelessness was so extreme that it resulted in someone's death. It's about a breach of duty of care that was so egregious that it's considered criminal.
Can you give me an example to help illustrate this? Because gross negligence sounds pretty serious.
Absolutely. One of the most well-known cases is RV at Damaco.
Oh,
An
wow.
anesthesiologist was in charge of a patient during surgery, and he failed to notice that the patient's breathing tube had become disconnected.
Wow.
The patient ended up dying.
Oh, wow. That's a nightmare scenario.
It is, and the court in that case found the anesthesiologist guilty of gross negligence manslaughter. They said he had a duty of care to his patient, and his failure to monitor the patient's breathing fell so far below the expected standard of care that it was criminal.
So it's not just about making a mistake.
And no,
It's about a level of carelessness that demonstrates a shocking disregard for someone's life.
exactly. The Adamico case actually set some important legal precedent for what constitutes gross negligence manslaughter.
Mm.
The prosecution has to prove a few things: that there was a duty of care,
Okay.
that the defendant breached that duty, that the breach created a risk of death, that the breach actually caused the death, and that the negligence was so bad it should be considered criminal.
So there's a high bar for proving gross negligence manslaughter.
There is, yeah.
It has to be more than just a simple mistake or an oversight. It has to be a truly shocking level of negligence.
That's right. It's about holding people accountable for failing to meet the basic standards of care that society expects, especially in professions where people's lives are at stake.
Okay, that makes sense. So with constructive manslaughter, it's about a death resulting from an unlawful act.
Right.
With gross negligence manslaughter, it's about a death resulting from extreme carelessness or a breach of duty of care.
Exactly.
It seems like there could be some overlap between the two.
Yeah, there definitely can be.
Like, where do you draw the line?
That's a great point. There are definitely cases where the lines can get blurry, but generally speaking, if there's a clear unlawful act involved, it's more likely to fall under constructive manslaughter. If it's more about a failure to act or a serious lapse in judgment, then gross negligence manslaughter might be more appropriate.
Okay. I think I'm starting to get a handle on these different types of manslaughter.
Good.
But I'm sure there are even more nuances and legal complexities that we could delve into.
Oh, absolutely. There's a whole world of legal precedent and fascinating cases that we could explore.
Like what?
For example, we could talk about how intervening acts, things that happen after the defendant's actions but before the victim's death,
Okay.
can affect responsibility.
Right.
Or we could look at the principle that defendants take their victims as they find them,
Okay.
meaning they can't use a victim's pre-existing conditions to lessen their own blame.
Wow, this is definitely a deep dive.
It is.
And it seems like every case has its own unique set of circumstances and legal arguments.
It does, and that's what makes criminal law so fascinating.
Yeah.
It's about applying these general principles to real-life situations that are often messy and unpredictable.
Well, I'm definitely hooked before we move on, though. I want to make sure I understand the key difference between voluntary and involuntary manslaughter.
Yep.
Voluntary manslaughter is when there might have been intent to kill,
Yes.
but there were mitigating circumstances, while involuntary manslaughter is when there was no intent to kill.
Correct.
But death resulted from unlawful actions or gross negligence. Did I get that right?
You nailed it. You're clearly a fast learner when it comes to legal concepts.
Well, I have a great teacher.
Hmm.
Okay, so now that we've got a solid understanding of those two types of manslaughter, maybe we can move on to some of those additional nuances you mentioned,
Okay.
like intervening acts and pre-existing conditions.
Let's do it. Those are some of the most interesting and challenging aspects of criminal law.
All right, my brain is officially fried after all that talk about murder and manslaughter.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in.
We've covered so much ground, from definitions and legal tests to real-life cases that highlight just how complicated this all can be.
It's definitely not a simple subject, but I think we've done a good job of breaking it down, into digestible pieces.
I hope so. I know I've learned a ton. What about you, dear listener? Are you starting to feel like you could hold your own in a legal debate?
I hope so.
Maybe not quite ready to be a barrister, but at least able to follow along with those true crime documentaries a little better.
I mean, those shows can be entertaining, but remember, they often gloss over the legal nuances we've been discussing.
True, they're not exactly giving the full picture of how complicated the law really is. Speaking of nuances, you mentioned earlier that we should talk about intervening acts. What are those exactly?
Intervening acts are basically events that happen after the defendant's actions but before the victim's death. And they can sometimes complicate the question of causation.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Can you give me an example?
Okay, imagine someone is assaulted and seriously injured,
Okay.
and then they're taken to the hospital. But let's say they receive negligent medical treatment,
Right.
and that negligence ultimately leads to their death.
Oh, wow. So then the question becomes, did the original assault cause the death, or was it the medical negligence?
Exactly. That's what the courts have to figure out.
Yeah.
Was the intervening act, in this case, the negligent medical treatment, so significant that it breaks the chain of causation between the original assault and the death?
That seems like a really tricky thing to determine. How do the courts actually decide in cases like that?
It's not easy, that's for sure.
Yeah.
They have to look at all the evidence, the severity of the original injury, the nature of the medical treatment, and whether the death was a reasonably foreseeable consequence of the original act.
So if the original injury was severe enough that the victim was likely to die anyway, even with proper medical care,
Right.
then the intervening act of medical negligence might not break the chain of causation?
Right, but if the medical treatment was so outrageously bad that it was clearly the main cause of death, then the original attacker might not be held fully responsible for the death. There's this case R.V. Cheshire,
Okay.
where a guy was shot and needed a tracheotomy. He later developed breathing problems because of complications from the tracheotomy and died.
So the shooter tried to argue that it was the medical negligence, not the gunshot, that caused the death.
Exactly. But the court said, no way. Even though the medical treatment was a factor, the gunshot wound was still the main cause of death. Basically, they said, you can't just blame the doctors when the victim was already seriously injured because of your actions.
That makes sense. You're responsible for the consequences of your actions, even if other things happen later on.
Right. And speaking of consequences, there's another important principle the courts consider, and it's often phrased as, you take your victim as you find them.
Okay, I'm not sure what that means. Can you elaborate?
It basically means that you can't use a victim's pre-existing conditions as an excuse to lessen your own blame.
Okay.
For example, if you punch someone who has a heart condition and they die from a heart attack,
Right.
you can't argue that it was their heart condition, not your punch, that caused the death.
You're basically saying you should have known better than to punch someone with a heart condition.
That's the gist of it. There's a famous case, R.V. Blau, where a woman was stabbed and refused a blood transfusion because of her religious beliefs. She died as a result, and the attacker tried to argue that it was her refusal of the transfusion, not the stabbing, that caused her death.
So he was trying to blame the victim for her own death?
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the court rejected that argument, saying the attacker had to take his victim as he found her, including her religious beliefs.
That's a powerful statement. It's saying that you're responsible for the full consequences of your actions, even if the victim's own choices or conditions play a role.
It's a complex area of law, but it highlights the idea that we can't just pick and choose which parts of a situation we want to be held accountable for.
That makes sense. We've talked a lot about individual responsibility, but what about when companies or organizations are involved? You mentioned corporate manslaughter earlier. Can you tell me more about that?
Yeah, corporate manslaughter is a relatively new area of law,
Oh, okay.
and it's designed to hold companies accountable when their actions or negligence lead to a death. It's not easy to prove, though, because you have to show that the company itself as a separate legal entity had the necessary guilty mind for a crime in legal terms. That's called mens rea.
So it's not enough to just show that an employee of the company was negligent. You have to prove that the company as a whole was responsible.
Right. A landmark case in this area is Tesco Supermarkets Ltd v. Natras.
Okay.
This case established what's known as the identification principle.
What's that?
It means that to prosecute a company for manslaughter, you have to identify a directing mind within the company, usually a senior executive, and prove that their actions or decisions were the driving force behind the events that led to the death.
So it's about finding the person or people who are calling the shots and holding them accountable for the company's actions.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that corporations, even though they're not individuals, can still be held responsible for their behavior.
It's a pretty big deal, right? It's saying that corporations have a moral and legal obligation to operate safely and responsibly, and if they don't, they can face serious consequences.
It is a big deal. And it's led to some important changes in how companies manage risk safety protocols and their overall approach to corporate responsibility.
Wow, this has been such an eye-opening conversation. We've gone from the basics of murder and manslaughter to the complexities of causation, intervening acts, corporate responsibility. It's a lot to take in.
Yeah, it definitely covers a lot of ground.
Well, I think we've done a pretty good job of untangling some of those legal knots, at least enough to get our listeners thinking and maybe even spark some further exploration.
I hope so.
It's fascinating stuff, even if it's a bit heavy at times.
It is.
So, to our listeners out there, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into UK criminal law. We hope you found it informative and engaging, and who knows, maybe this knowledge will come in handy someday.
Maybe.
You never know when you might need to impress someone with your criminal law expertise. Until next time, stay curious and stay safe.